Svitlana Morenets is a Ukrainian journalist and a staff writer at The Spectator. She was named Young Journalist of the Year in 2024 UK Press Awards. She is author of the weekly newsletter Ukraine in Focus. And before we get in, I strongly advise you to check out some of her journalism. It's some of the strongest and most interesting takes on what is happening in Ukraine that can be found in the UK press at this time. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and definitely subscribe. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel to ensure you don't miss out on any of the daily content that we produce. And please also do check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video. It's incredibly important to help Ukrainian society remain resilient, to help Ukrainian veterans, and of course, to help the Ukrainian army fight back against Russian aggression. Svitlana, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to Silicon Curtain.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we put together a bunch of questions, but this has sort of in some ways been superseded. So let's start the discussion with what's happened this week. It's been an absolutely horrific week of carnage. The Russian world has come to Lviv and multiple other cities in Ukraine, and we've seen absolutely tragic scenes unfolding. But we haven't seen much of a response from Western allies. What on earth is going on?
This week has been incredibly deadly in Ukraine, and it is only Thursday as we speak with you. First, Russia used its two precise Iskander missiles to strike a military institution in Poltava, killing over 50 people and injuring over 200. And also yesterday, there was an attack in Lviv against residential buildings. 7 people died, including 2 children. Kharkiv is almost every day under deadly attacks. So Ukrainians are very furious, of course, at Russia, but also at Joe Biden for not allowing Ukraine to strike Russian airfields with American weapons. And it seems that the only option left for Ukrainians right now is just to tweet gruesome photos and videos of the victims of the attacks and just hoping that the allies will notice it and will change their position. And the reaction of the US was that they keep supporting Ukraine, Ukraine must stay strong, and like thoughts and prayers. And of course, for Ukrainians who suffer every day from these attacks and people die every day, they see it as a mocking of their everyday suffering.
And it seems we are back into that phase of for as long as it takes, one of the most ambiguous and perhaps weakest political phrases ever to be pronounced. Unfortunately, all the allies came in behind that. The question is, for as long as what takes, and how long is long? Because Ukraine doesn't have infinite resources, doesn't have infinite people. And in fact, as we know, Ukraine is losing its best people. And that's if we look at both the civilian and the military side of things.
For me, the phrase "as long as it takes" sounds like as long as Ukraine lasts, because it just shows that the allies don't have a plan how they see this war end. They don't have a plan whether they want to see Ukraine victorious and what this victory will mean. Is it Ukraine returning to its international recognized borders of 1991, or it is some other ending? There is no plan, and I think it is the worst because Ukrainians just keep fighting without knowing what the ending will be, when it will be. It's quite interesting that last week at the press conference in Kyiv, Zelenskyy said that he is ready to present a victory plan to Joe Biden and Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And he didn't say what is in that plan. He said just the Kursk offensive was one of the key points to force Russia to negotiate. And Zelensky's victory plans are known to be overly ambitious. For example, last year, his 10 points peace plan was about Russia withdrawing all of its troops, recognizing Ukrainian lands in 1991 borders. And of course, at the peace summit, the countries that were participating, not everybody was ready to put a signature after below that because they didn't see it as something realistic. But I would say that everything what Ukraine is doing right now with the Kursk offensive and Zelensky talking about his peace plans, about negotiations, is a preparation for American elections and for the second peace summit in November, because we don't know who will win the US elections and Zelensky and what their plan will be regarding Ukraine. So Zelensky hopes that at least this plan will be based on his proposal, at least partly. So he's rushing to do that. And also he wants the Russian representatives to be at the second peace summit, because at the first one in Switzerland, there were no Russian representatives and it was not very effective. And now he says that a lot of countries are demanding it and saying if there will be no Russian representative, then they won't participate. But the problem is also that now Russia is refusing any negotiations because Ukrainian troops are holding 500 square miles of Russian land in the Kursk region. So it will be quite difficult to force Russia to the talks.
There's a fundamental, I think, problem that's been there since the start of the war, and that is that Putin's mindset, never mind his strategy, won't even get into his sort of strategy and historical mythology that underpins it, but his strategy has been to escalate into every crisis, not just in the full-scale war, but over 20 years. And in fact, that's what he's trained to do. He's trained to resort to aggression. He's trained to be paranoid. He's trained not to trust. This combination of escalation and paranoia is really not the basis for any kind of negotiation. So is this kind of a delusion to think that a negotiated path is possible? Or is the Ukrainian side cynical enough to understand that any agreement with Russia is only going to be temporary and contingent on whatever Russia wants at a particular point in time? There can be no permanent treaties, at least with the Putin regime.
I think what Ukrainian government is trying to do right now is to show that they are the ones who want to end the war and start negotiations, because last year it was quite the opposite. Kyiv was refusing to negotiate, and Russia was saying they are ready to hold talks, taking into account the situation on the ground, meaning to split Ukraine on the battlefield line. But the situation on the ground changed since the Kursk offensive happened, and now Russian land is occupied. And I think it's what Ukrainian government is trying to do, to present Ukraine as the one who wants peace and negotiate. And then if Russia refuses, then the only options that Western allies have is to keep supporting Ukraine, because Russia doesn't want to negotiate. I don't know if they will succeed about that, because you are right about saying that Putin just keeps escalating the war. And the Western allies are so scared of escalation, but actually Russia is the one who constantly doing that. And as the Kursk offensive was stabilized, and like the biggest threat for the region was stopped, Russia just keeps pressing in the Donetsk region, advancing towards Pokrovsk, the strategical logistic hub in the Donetsk region. And Ukraine expected that Russia would withdraw some of its troops from that direction, but quite the opposite happened. The most battle-trained troops were sent to that direction, and the Russian offensive there is very successful. And that victorious mood, the morale boost that the Kursk offensive gave for Ukrainians, it vanished very fast, considering how hard the situation in Donetsk right now is.
And I think there's a tendency, isn't there, to look at that and label Russians as successful, but essentially they're taking charge of cities that are rubble. They do not have the resources or the capability of maneuver warfare to get anywhere near Kiev or take Kharkiv or anything that could be termed a real military strategic success. So in the short term, we look at it and say, yes, they're advancing. But in the big picture, it's not a real victory. And yet, Kursk, because we're going to talk about Kursk, we're going to talk about red lines. Kursk is an extraordinary psychological blow to the Russian regime. And it makes the question, I think, and I'd be very interested to hear what you think, it makes the question of how Russia is going to prosecute the war for another 3 months, another 6 months, another 9 months. It's pushing Putin towards mobilization and the necessity for mobilization. And there's a good reason he's avoided that up until now, because that does represent, I think, a significant point of potential instability for his regime. It breaks a kind of social contract with the richer, educated urban elite if he starts conscripting their children into the army. So do you think there's some interesting strategic benefits to Kursk? Even if on the sort of simple military plane, it might look like, you've gained land here and lost land there, but actually there are some significant strategic benefits still to Kursk.
Of course, there are, but unfortunately, the longer the war lasts, the less sensitive to it people become. And for example, the first Russian soldiers that died in the war 2 years ago, when their bodies were brought back to Russia, they were more dangerous to the regime, those deaths, than right now, because right now the numbers go to dozens of thousands. The same was like when Ukrainian drones were first launched into Belgorod region towards Moscow, when they touched one building of the Kremlin. Everybody was shocked, and there was a big discussion in Russian society about that. But after 2 years of the full-scale war, it seems that not as shocking to Russians anymore, and people are just fleeing from Kursk region. And yes, they are complaining that the evacuation is bad, but there is no uprising, or I don't know, whatever you can call it, no like big anger towards the Russian government. There is any of that, and it seems that for the Kremlin, it is okay that Ukrainian army holds some villages in the Kursk region as long as they are far from Moscow. And for them, the main objective is to capture the Donbass. Because, as you said, Russian army doesn't have the people and resources to capture Kyiv or Kharkiv, but they need to present certain victory in the end. Why did it happen? Why the invasion was launched? So at least to say that Donbass was liberated is the least they can do.
And this is perhaps the most shocking part, because you mentioned the strike on the Kremlin, and of course they had plausible deniability. There was lots of debate about who did it, although after a couple of weeks, I think most people aligned on the idea that it was Ukraine. But when they hit Rublevka, that was far more interesting because, of course, almost immediately Budanov kind of gave a hint that, of course, that was Ukraine. And this was fascinating because many Russian people actually, some of them cheered it. When they're hitting corrupt officials, chinovniki and those, and it's their dachas getting blown away, that created an interesting schism between the sort of elite and the people. And it exposed some of those fault lines. I think immediately the US probably put pressure never to do that again. It's also rumored that the US has put pressure not to hit oil infrastructure. Well, Ukraine has blown through those red lines. Thank goodness they have. The question we need to ask is, what other buffer zone is the US and Berlin creating? What safe zone for Russian launch sites, airfields, and what else have they ruled out that could actually be incredibly important for Ukraine to, as you say, cut through the sort of indifference that has been created and reach another level that may stimulate the Russian people into asking whether this war is actually beneficial to them or not. It seems the US is in some ways protecting Putin's regime.
There is a saying in Ukraine right now that the US is protecting more Russian airfields than Ukrainian civilians, and I think it quite well represents what's happening right now. I think one of the reasons why Ukraine is not allowed to strike Russian airfields with long-range weapons is because US fears that Ukraine will target also oil refineries in Russia. And of course, it disrupts Russian economy and it impacts the global market. And the last time the US said don't do it, there was a big scandal in Ukraine. And anyway, Ukraine kept launching its drones towards Russian oil facilities. The same happened with the Kursk offensive, that the allies didn't know about it, because first, even Zelenskyy said it himself, because they would see it as something unrealistic first, and second, like the reddest of red lines that would escalate the war to a nuclear conflict. And the Kursk operation proved that these fears are unjustified and nothing happened. But also there is a problem that about the US elections. I don't think that Biden will risk undermining Kamala Harris's campaigning, but by allowing Ukraine to strike deeper into Russia with American weapons, because in Trump's speeches, he says that Democrats are leading us to World War III, to nuclear conflict, that Americans will have to grab weapons and go fight in Ukraine. And allowing Ukraine to strike deep into Russia with American weapons will only support his claims and attract more people to vote for him. So I think before the election, nothing will change. What Biden could do is to allow Ukraine to use British Storm Shadow missiles, because the British government is very keen for Ukraine to use their missiles, for at least in the Kursk region, but they are afraid to say it publicly, because they had already disagreements with Washington before, when they were the first nation to advocate to give Ukraine modern battle tanks and to promote the idea of giving Ukraine F-16 fighter jets, while the Washington was like, we are not ready yet, it is escalation. So after that disagreement with London, now British mode is quite trying to stay calm and waiting for the Washington to give the green light. But this wouldn't endanger the election campaign. Biden could do it now, and Britain is very keen for Storm Shadow missiles to be used. But anyway, he doesn't do that. And Ukrainian government says that there are still targets that can be struck in Russia, because Biden administration keeps repeating that Russia already moved most of its aircrafts from the airfields. They say that 90% were moved, but Ukraine could strike the logistic routes, the Russian troops that are amassed along the border, because of course we have the permission to strike them with the HIMARS, but we have very limited supply of these missiles and systems, and we could have used different missiles and systems, not just one. The results would be different. And I think that how Kyiv wants these negotiations to come is to put pressure on Russia economically to strike its energy infrastructure the same it does in Ukraine. It's very important thing right now, because most of the summer Ukrainians spent with severe blackouts, with some people having just 2 hours of electricity per day. And in winter, when the heating will be on and temperature will go below like minus 20 degrees, it's a big pressure on a society. And there were negotiations between the Russian representatives and Ukrainian ones about stopping attacking each other energy infrastructure. But because of the Kursk offensive, the negotiations fell apart slightly. So For Kyiv, it will be like striking Russian energy infrastructure while Russia strikes ours. So how to convince Russia to stop it? We won't strike your energy infrastructure and you don't strike ours. For this plan to work, Ukraine needs that permission.
Yeah, it seems to me that's a delusional hope because Russia has never held back from inflicting pain and misery. And I think we have to put it in some context, don't we? Every time some kind of safe corridor has been negotiated, whether it's civilians coming out of Mariupol at the start of the war, whether it's Debaltseve and any kind of negotiation to allow Ukrainian troops out, or indeed the treatment of Azov fighters, Russia may say one thing and then it will carry out some obscene criminal act on the other at the same time as supposedly negotiating, supposedly holding the West at bay, persuading them not to do something because you'll spoil negotiations. And then under the cover of that, it commits some horrific crime.
I think the difference is when Ukraine made those agreements, Ukraine was in a weak position because Russia was winning, advancing. And what Ukraine needs right now is to have a strong hand, whether any negotiations will come. And holding a piece of Russian land is to have a strong hand. Attacking, having the possibilities to attack Russian oil fields, oil refineries, energy infrastructure, is to have a strong hand. Because the most horrific negotiations that was with Russia was when Ukrainian troops retreated from Ilovaisk in 2014. Yes, in 2014. And there was supposed to be a green corridor for Ukrainian troops, but they were just massacred there, and like hundreds were killed, over 1,000 were injured. So how could Ukraine trust any negotiations with Russia? But at that moment, Ukraine lost the battle in the Donetsk region. They lost the battle for Ilovaisk. But this time it can be different if Ukraine is in a stronger position, if it has more sufficient support from allies and thoughts and prayers and some shadow security guarantees. Maybe the outcome this time will be different.
And of course, that plays into the Russian mindset, which is that you have to meet Russia with equal or superior strength, and then it will reevaluate its position. And that's been true over hundreds of years of Russian imperial history. Doesn't mean the aggression will end. They might come back, a year later, a decade later, a generation later. But if you meet them with equal or superior force, they are rational in that sense, and they'll recognize that sort of force. And this is where it comes in, I think, to what you mentioned earlier, which is really interesting. Two things come together. Zelenskyy is going to be presenting a so-called plan for victory. That surely cannot just be negotiation. Ukraine would have to significantly increase its hand, maybe the amount of Russian territory it possesses, or some leverage over Russia beyond what it currently has. Because as you say, Kursk clearly is not enough to bring Putin to the negotiating table. And this idea that he's refusing to negotiate because of Kursk, I think that's just theater. If the stakes get high enough, of course, he's going to negotiate in some kind of way. Also, Zelenskyy's list of targets, he's taken this list of targets to Washington to say, come on, look, you can see that these airfields, these Shahed launch sites are massacring civilians. Just let us take these out. And it could be storm shadows. I think there has been some commentary from various military people on the channel that actually Britain couldn't unilaterally authorize use of these. It requires maybe not launch codes, but it requires some kind of intelligence or targeting information from the US. So we cannot act unilaterally there, unfortunately. But if Biden doesn't even go along with this perfectly militarily sensible, sort of almost no red lines list, if he doesn't go along with that, how is he going to buy into what will probably be a much more adventurous, much more optimistic and widespread plan for victory? I mean, that surely will be quite triggering for someone as cautious as Biden and his national security advisor.
Ukraine is trying to present this plan and of targets in Russia as something that Biden could do as his final great achievement as a president, for what he will be praised for forever in Ukraine, and not seen like someone who didn't allow Ukraine to protect its civilian population. I don't think it will work, honestly, especially given recent reports that Washington is less scared about escalation, as they are fearing. They want to restore their relationship with Russia eventually. And they are fearing that the permission to strike Russian land with long-range American missiles will sabotage those plans. I don't know, to be honest. For Zelensky, I think Biden won't do much before the elections. For Zelensky right now, the goal is to convince Trump, is very difficult, or Kamala Harris, which is more probable, about what Ukraine needs to keep fighting and to end this war victorious, whatever he means right now with that. Because at the beginning, Zelensky was saying that the only path to victory is to return all the Ukrainian territories in a military way, but now he says that it should be done in a diplomatic way. So we will see.
Yeah, I reserve a degree of cynicism around how that could possibly work. Another interesting, perhaps less troubling, but interesting development is the movement of substantial Belarusian military hardware to the border. Is this another piece of theater, or is Lukashenko potentially under so much pressure he may intervene in the war? It has been pointed out by some of the military commentators on this channel that from the sort of OSINT information they've seen, that Belarusian kit is outdated, potentially has very little chance of surviving even the kind of weapons that Ukraine has, and even after the ammunition famine, it wouldn't fare too well. With javelins, NLAWs, etc. There's no electronic warfare, anti-electronic warfare equipment seen on those vehicles, so they certainly would be extremely vulnerable to drone attacks. And we've also seen that the Belarusian military in 2022 was on the point potentially of revolt at the prospect of being sent into Ukraine, and then Lukashenko sort of stepped back from that. So what on earth is kind of going on here? Is this a piece of theater to please Putin? Is it designed as a distraction to try and get Ukraine to, suck troops away from the front to protect that northern border? What are your interpretation?
Belarusian troops have been holding exercises close to Ukrainian border throughout all 2 years of the full-scale war, and they were sometimes close to the border, sometimes they were withdrawing. And before the Kursk offensive, like several weeks before, Belarusian troops were withdrawn from Ukrainian border because Lukashenko said there is no threat anymore that Ukrainians will attack Belarus. Of course, it is nonsense that there was such kind of threat, but doesn't matter. So Russia actually blames Lukashenko for withdrawing his troops, which supposedly allowed Ukraine to use some of the brigades that were north of Kyiv to attack the Kursk region. So now for Lukashenko, he has to show that he is doing his job, and to please Moscow, he sent some troops to the border with Ukraine. But I'm sure that Lukashenko doesn't want to get involved in the war with his army. Of course, Belarus is an aggressor state by international law because it allowed Russia to launch its army from the Belarusian land, also the drones, the missiles, but its army has not been fighting in Ukraine. And quite interesting that last night Russia launched like 60 drones, Iranian drones towards Ukraine, and 2 of them flew into Belarus, and Belarusian Air Force had to shoot them down. So I think it's quite unlikely that Belarusian troops will join the war. Of course, there is always a chance that Moscow will pressure Lukashenko, but Belarusian soldiers don't want to fight against Ukrainians. Ukrainians and Belarusians always had closer relationship. And as you mentioned, in 2022, when there was a possibility that Belarusian troops would join Russian army, there was it looked like it was leading to a uprising among soldiers, and Lukashenko cares a lot about his regime, and I don't think he would risk that. But I think there is still a probability of some kind of provocation, because for the first time, Ukrainian Foreign Ministry officially published a statement asking Belarus to withdraw its troops because they are very close to Ukrainian Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And of course, it's very dangerous for Ukrainian security. And there are Wagner mercenaries who are also at the border. So I think it's more likely that Wagner mercenaries will move forward, but not Belarusian troops.
It's an interesting question, isn't it? Whether Wagner mercenaries are there for an incursion or whether Lukashenko no longer trusts his own Belarusian generals, and the Wagner mercenaries could be in there just as a kind of threat, just to put some kind of pressure. In some ways, the way Putin uses Chechens to terrorize members of his own elite as well. That's a little unknown element there of a sort of wild card.
I think it is the Kremlin who doesn't trust Lukashenko and his forces, and that's why they sent Wagner there to make sure that whatever they planned happens. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense as well. It raises the question about what is the priority, especially in Washington and Berlin. You've mentioned this idea of an eventual reset. I think my view is that at the moment that is an obscenity to even think about that, but nonetheless, it kind of makes sense that they would be doing that in their framework, not perhaps in ours. But what other concerns are there? You mentioned that they fear escalation. Possibly they fear nuclear catastrophe from a potential collapse of Russia, or an escalation on the part of Russia. What are the strategic considerations that are informing these red lines, that are causing these red lines to be constantly drawn and in many cases probably imagined in the minds of planners in especially Washington and Berlin?
I'm afraid they don't want Russia to lose. And anyway, they have deep economic ties, especially Germany with Russia, and eventually they would want to work with Russia. Of course, not in the nearest future. Also, of course, as the election campaign goes on, they want to make sure that their armies won't be involved in the conflict. They even refuse to send their troops to train Ukrainian soldiers in Ukraine, not because they would be in danger of Russian missile strikes, but because Russia could see it as escalation and the West joining the war directly. Also, it's about Russia not using tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. But I think it's highly unlikely that they will do it because China wouldn't like them to do it. Because if Russia uses tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield, then it changes how the Taiwan will be defended. Then it will allow to use tactical nuclear weapons to defend Taiwan. And I don't think Russia will do anything against China's will. For Ukrainians, when we see all these red lines, there were so many red lines throughout this war: not to use Western tanks, not to use Western aircrafts, not to cross into Russia, not to strike Russia, and not to strike Crimea or Kerch Bridge. And every time when Ukrainians did it, it proved that there are no such red lines. And the only response that Kremlin had was just to keep sending their soldiers to a meat grinder and launching mass attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure. So it feels like a betrayal, to be honest. Like the allies don't really want Ukraine to win. They just want to give us enough to keep fighting, to hold on as long as it takes. But what comes after that? Our people are not infinite, and we had so many losses already, and the conscription is so hard right now. There is such a big lack of people on the front line. I was in July in the Kharkiv front, and there was not only problem with the shells and weapons, but also that soldiers didn't have reinforcements and they were not given a holiday for over 2 years. They were very tired. Their morale was very low. Of course, the Kursk offensive boosted their morale, but not for very long. They need something else for doing that. And right now, the thing about approving $50 billion of the aid from frozen Russian assets for Ukraine. Just before having this interview with you, I saw news that it's going to be delayed again because initially it was planned as a safety aid for Ukraine in case if Donald Trump wins the elections. If the US cuts its aid completely, then Ukraine would have this 50 billion to purchase weapons and to support the economy. But now, as there is a possibility of Kamala Harris winning, the allies don't see necessary to rush with this package. And there were a lot of disagreements between the EU and the US about there is a problem that the review of the sanctions on Russian assets has to happen every 6 months. And all 27 EU members have to agree to keep these sanctions going on every 6 months. And there is a country like Hungary who stalls it every time and opposes every time or vetoes it. And their veto could mean that those frozen Russian assets would be unfrozen. And then if Ukraine were to receive these promises, the US would have to pay these 50 billion from their budget. So the solution would be or to make these sanctions indefinite, like for several years that they will be working, or to make that to approve the sanctions. Not every country has to agree to it, but just the majority. But all these processes to approve it, to change how this bureaucracy works in the EU, it takes so much time, months. And during this time, Ukrainian soldiers keep dying and the aid keeps being stalled. And several weeks ago, Zelenskyy was quite desperately talking on his evening address, and he was saying that allies wait for one aid package to run out and only then to announce another one. But from the moment they announce aid package, it doesn't mean that the supplies go to Ukraine in that second. It takes days, weeks for weapons to arrive. So the strategy towards this has to be changed too. And there is 6 billion in US budget right now that were supposed to go to Ukraine, and there is time until the end of the month for them to dislocate it, to approve it. If they don't do it, then the budget will the year of budget year will end, and then this money Ukraine won't receive this money. And on Independence Day, Ukraine's Independence Day, US announced like over $100 million in military aid for Ukraine. But what about those 6 billions that were allocated, but they don't use them?
It's extraordinary, isn't it? There's the sense of not just drip feeding weapons as a strategy that has definitely gone on, but also the just sheer complacency. If this was an existential struggle to the Allies, if their civilians, if their cities were under threat, then I think people should be under no doubt that they would move far, far faster. And I think that talks to two things, doesn't it? One is, unfortunately, Ukraine just does not seem to be top of their priority list. Anyone watching this channel, Ukraine is the number one issue in the world that needs to be resolved. The absolutely most important thing, and victory for Ukraine would have a knock-on effect in resolving so many other problems, including information warfare, sabotage, various conflicts around the world. I think strategically look at it, this is the number one issue. And many other things that are perceived to be chaos around the world will be shown to actually be connected to this struggle. But this does not seem to be how decision makers are thinking. And this does not seem to be top of the priority list for people like Jake Sullivan. And when it does come across their desk, something you mentioned earlier, which is an absolute fear of Russia and almost an internalization of Russia's terror threats, seems to be restricting their action. With that in mind, what's your interpretation of the fact that Russia seems to try to hit the dam north of Kharkiv, north of Kiev, rather, and there's a fear there that sort of radioactive dust could be released if the water level falls. You've got the Kursk nuclear facility, you've got Zaporizhia nuclear facility. Russia seems prepared to use this nuclear button to carry on pressing against allies, to carry on pressuring them not to support Ukraine.
About the dam, we saw last year when Novokakhovka Dam was destroyed by Russia, and those reports of the Western media that they are not sure who did it, and both sides are blaming each other. And the reaction of the allies was like, we condemn it, and that's all. And I think Russia is allowed to do a lot of things and go unpunished. And Ukraine, for us Ukrainians, I fear that even if they do something to Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, for example, that the allies' response will be just condolences and condemnations, and that's all. It's hard to predict what Putin will do, but it's harder to be sure that the allies will have a strong response to that. And I was in Kyiv when Russia struck the Ohmadet Children's Hospital. I was at the scene, and Ukrainians were hoping that it was the moment when the allies will allow to hit Russian aircrafts, so Russia wouldn't bomb cancer children. But no, it didn't happen. I think the allies are much more scared of Russia than needed. It is not as scary. Look, Ukraine, everybody believed that Kyiv would hold for 3 days and fall, that Ukraine wouldn't last for long. And I think a lot of people don't understand how strong Ukraine is by fighting the largest country in the world for over 2 years, and standing how strong our army is and what are the possibilities and the drone warfare that was developed in Ukraine. And right now there are over 100 companies who produce drones in Ukraine and supply the army. I think there would be much lesser risk of escalation if Ukraine was given more tools and just to come to Russia from the position of strength. Because when Ukraine is weak, Russia would keep escalating because they will see the chances that they can win. They can advance slowly, losing a lot of troops, but they can keep doing it.
And that leads. I mean, I've got just two more questions. I know we're running out of time now. One really is a response to that. The Ahmadiyya Children's Hospital, and then nothing happened on the Allies' side in response. Even I was shocked by that, and I've come to not be shocked by almost anything that we see. And this week, there seems to be some kind of connection because you have the mass targeting of civilians, the absolutely intentional mass targeting of civilians. I rather fear that Russia understands the Western mindset far better than Western policymakers understand the Russian mindset. And they're not just hitting these targets like the hospital, like the residential buildings. They're not just doing it to terrorize Ukrainians. I think they're also doing it to mock Western politicians, to literally jeer at them and provide ammunition for their own cynical Z patriots and politicians, red meat for them to say, look, we can do whatever we like. And the West is weak, the West is decadent, the West is failing, and therefore we're strong. Don't even think about challenging the regime because we're strong and we're cruel and we are infinitely more cynical than the West. And you don't want to ally yourselves with them because they're weak. Is that too cynical, or does this perhaps a description you recognize of the Russian mindset, the cruelty and nihilism of it?
You're completely right, and Putin's visit to Mongolia this week was a proof to that, because Mongolia is a part of the International Criminal, is a member of International Criminal Court, and they would have to arrest Putin. And Putin came there knowing that it won't happen because Mongolia is dependent on Russia because of their energy connections. And he just came there. I think it was just a spectacle to show to the West that all their institutions that were set after the Second World War finished, they don't work. The same with the UN. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 while it was chairing the UN. And then during these 2 years, there is a rotation, and Russia was chairing the UN again. And it's unbelievable that the country that launched the war is a chair of the UN or even a member. And the UN proved to be useless. The Red Cross proved to be useless because they were supposed to be the ones who go to the prisoners of war, to the occupied lands, to make sure that Russia treats the population well, they don't torture them, don't kill them. They don't have what they say, they don't have access to those lands, and that's all. The same goes for the International Atomic Energy and its leader, Rafael Grossi, if I'm saying his name right. Just this week, he went to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to check if it's safe, what Russian occupying forces are doing there. And there was a video published of him arriving there. And he left the car and he went and he hugged the occupying authorities. And he said, I'm so happy to see you again. And they almost kissed there. And imagine Ukrainians watching it. Is it how you treat people who invaded your land? They occupied such a dangerous place like a nuclear power plant, and you greet them like that? So all of these institutions don't work, and Russia every time is just proving them. And I think Putin is just laughing at the West, and he sees it as weak. And the same when Russia invaded in 2022, one of the reasons was because Ukraine was weak, its army was weak, and Zelenskyy was a president, and Putin thought that as he has no experience, he's former comedian, then capturing Ukraine would be no problem because Zelenskyy would flee the next day. It didn't happen, thank God. But it's what happens when the aggressor sees your weakness.
And the last question feeds into that. What do the Western allies need to do at this point to show strength? What are the key priorities if they are actually going to align behind a concept of victory? And let's take Zelensky's 10-point plan, which is ambitious, but I think fair. What needs to happen to make victory real?
First is there has to be a plan how this war should end or what the final result should be, because as long as it takes doesn't work. Second, there has to be no red lines for Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine won't strike Russian kindergartens and schools and universities, and I think Ukraine has proven to be a reliable ally because it didn't cross those red lines while using Western missiles all this time. So there should be no hands tied behind Ukraine's back. Also, is to approve aid packages for Ukraine in time and supplying them in time using Russian frozen assets, which will boost Ukrainian capabilities much more. And there is a danger that if that package is approved of $50 billion, other countries will decrease their spending on helping Ukraine. I hope it didn't happen. If Ukraine were to win, it shouldn't happen. Also, sanctions against Russia, more effective ones on Russian diamonds and oil, everything, because the aggressor country has to be completely isolated from the developing world, so its population feel the consequences of the war. And it comes to my next point that the Russian population has to feel the consequences of the war. And it's not only economic consequences, but also what Ukraine does by bringing war back to Russian soil and striking Russian military infrastructure, oil facilities, airfields. Some say that probably in the future, if Ukraine is capable of holding the lands in the Kursk region, they could be later exchanged for Ukrainian lands. And I think it is the most good plan. I don't know how to say it correctly, because there is no way, unfortunately, the moment that Ukrainian troops can breach the front line in the Donetsk region or in Zaporizhia region, because Russian fortifications are extremely well made. They're mined. There are kilometers of trenches. So the only way is by making an exchange, and Ukraine would need to capture more Russian land and more valuable Russian land, because currently those couple of villages Ukraine holds, okay, almost 100 settlements, but it is nothing compared to 30% of Ukrainian territory that Russia holds. So I think the main tasks of the Ukraine and Western allies is the continuous military support and economical support, no red lines, and allowing Ukraine to fight and as it sees it is possible. And because Ukrainian commanders are very experienced, and in this decade of war with Russia, they know how to fight it, they just need the tools.
And that's incredibly important, I think. And I'm sure we will revisit these topics because it looks likely that Ukraine will hold that Kursk region through the winter. And that seems to be the intention, to take it through to a potential negotiation. And one assumes that more collateral will be needed to get Russia to come to the table. That potentially means that Bryansk and Belgorod and other regions could potentially be future targets if Ukraine has the strength and the support of allies to do that. Svitlana, it's been such a tremendous pleasure. I've looked forward to this conversation for a while, and it certainly hasn't disappointed. I think this is one of the strongest conversations recently. So many issues we've managed to cover as well. Love to speak again as things unfold. And lastly, I once again recommend people check out your incredible journalism for The Spectator. It's definitely worth following your weekly newsletter on what's happening in Ukraine and its implications.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for supporting Ukraine and discussing these important topics every day.